Everyone agrees on the story. Motorola built the RAZR, one of the best-selling phones in history, and then the iPhone showed up and wiped it off the map. Case closed. Another dinosaur that didn't see the smartphone coming. Except, that isn't what happened. Motorola didn't get caught off guard by Apple. Motorola had already gutted its own future years before the first iPhone was ever announced, and it did it with its own hands, using the profits from its greatest success. The RAZR didn't just fail to save the company. The RAZR is the reason the company had nothing left to fall back on when the fight actually started. This is the story of how a phone so good it sold for 4 straight years became the thing that killed the company that made it, and how a corporate raider finished the job while the men in charge argued about who deserved the credit. Before any of that though, subscribe, because we're about to get into exactly how a company can build the single most iconic phone of its era and still walk itself off a cliff. The company didn't start with phones. It started with a battery eliminator, a small device that let people run battery-powered radios off regular household current. Brothers Paul and Joseph Galvin launched the business in Chicago in 1928, and the battery eliminator flopped almost immediately because the radio industry was already moving toward AC-powered sets that didn't need the thing in the first place. What saved the company was cars. Radios were becoming the must-have accessory for automobiles, but early car radio installations were plagued by electrical interference from the engine, and most manufacturers hadn't solved it well. Galvin's engineers found a workable fix, and in 1930, the company released a car radio under a new brand name built to sound like it belonged next to the big audio names of the era. Names that leaned on the suffix "ola", the kind of ending that told customers this was a sound machine. The car radio was called Motorola, and the name eventually became the company's own. For decades, Motorola built a reputation on being the company that solved hard communication problems other people hadn't cracked yet. It built two-way radios used by police and the military. It built the radio equipment that carried the transmissions during the Apollo 11 moon landing, meaning some of the most famous words ever spoken by a human being were carried to Earth on Motorola-built hardware. It built pages that dominated the market for years. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Motorola wasn't just a phone company. It was one of the most trusted names in communications technology on the planet. And in the pager business specifically, it controlled the overwhelming majority of global sales. It also built the first handheld commercial mobile phone, the Dynatac, which hit the market in the early 1980s, at a price around $4,000. It was heavy, it was massive by today's standards, and it was still a genuine breakthrough, the ancestor of every phone that came after it. By the 1990s, Motorola was riding a wave most companies never get to experience. Pages alone were an enormous business, and Motorola controlled the overwhelming share of that global market, manufacturing devices by the millions and expanding aggressively into Eastern Europe, where pages were becoming the hot new consumer gadget, and into Asia, where the company ran multiple manufacturing operations to keep up with demand. Money was pouring in from every direction. But underneath the good numbers, a threat was building that the company badly underestimated. A Finnish company called Nokia was moving fast into digital mobile phones, treating the format as the clear future, while Motorola leaned harder on its dominance in the older analog and pager markets, businesses that felt safe precisely because they were already profitable. Meanwhile, personal digital assistants were starting to nibble at the same consumer attention phones and pages were competing for. Adding yet another front, Motorola wasn't moving fast enough to defend. Motorola also poured enormous resources into a side project that would quietly cripple its finances years before anyone had heard of the RAZR. That project was Iridium. The idea, conceived in the late 1980s, was to build a satellite phone network using dozens of low-orbit satellites, letting subscribers make calls from literally anywhere on Earth, no cell towers required. It was an audacious idea, and on paper, it looked like the kind of forward-looking bet that could make Motorola the dominant communications company for the next generation. Motorola put in an initial investment of around $400 million for a quarter stake in the venture and seats on its board, but that number kept climbing. Getting the full satellite network into orbit required billions more, and Motorola ended up on the hook as a guarantor for enormous loans on top of its direct investment. Development dragged on for roughly 7 years, through the early and mid-1990s, with Motorola pouring in money and engineering talent the entire time. By the time Iridium actually launched commercial service in 1998, the world had changed in ways the original plan from a decade earlier had never accounted for. Regular cellular networks had expanded dramatically and gotten far cheaper. While Iridium phones cost thousands of dollars, service ran several dollars a minute, and the phones themselves needed a clear line of sight to the sky to get any signal at all, meaning they barely worked indoors, in cities, or in moving vehicles, which happened to be exactly the environments most business travelers actually lived in. The launch marketing campaign, when it finally arrived, cost well over $100 million, and it still couldn't overcome the basic reality that the product simply didn't work the way people needed it to. The company that was supposed to serve traveling executives everywhere on Earth signed up a tiny fraction of the subscribers it needed, and the interest payments alone on Iridium's debt ran into tens of millions of dollars every single month. Within about a year, saddled with billions in debt and unable to make its loan payments, Iridium filed for bankruptcy in the summer of 1999. Because Motorola was the guarantor behind so much of that debt, it was Motorola that had to keep the lights on for the failing venture for months afterward, eventually selling off the remains of the project in 2000 for a small fraction of the billions that had been poured into it over the previous decade. In one of the stranger footnotes in tech history, the Iridium network itself survived under new ownership and still operates satellite phone service today, which means the failed bet Motorola nearly bankrupted itself over eventually became a real, if niche, business anyway, just not for Motorola. Here's the part almost nobody connects to what happened later. The Iridium wasn't just an embarrassing side story. It was a financial crater. By the time Motorola needed cash reserves to fight off Nokia, then Samsung, then eventually Apple, a huge chunk of the cushion that should have existed had already been burned on a satellite network that barely anyone used. The company entered the 21st century structurally weaker than it looked from the outside, right as its handset business started sliding into second place behind Nokia, and then further behind a wave of aggressive new competitors. By 2001, Motorola's mobile phone division posted its first loss in 15 years, and the forecast for the following year wasn't any better. The company managed to put out only a couple of color screen phones that whole year, at a moment when color displays were quickly becoming the baseline expectation rather than a premium feature. Motorola, the company that had built the first mobile phone on Earth, had fallen to a market share that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. The engineering was still solid, reliability was still strong, but nothing in the lineup made anyone want to walk into a store and buy one. There was no flagship, no identity, nothing that photographed well or made a headline. Chris Galvin, grandson of founder Paul Galvin, was running the company by this point, and his approach to the phone business was almost defiantly plain. Phones should make calls. Nothing more, no distractions, no wild experiments. It was a philosophy that made sense on a spreadsheet and made almost no sense to a market that was starting to treat phones as status objects and lifestyle accessories, the same way car buyers had started treating cars as personal statements decades earlier. Engineers grew restless under a leadership style that kept killing ambitious projects before they had a chance to prove themselves. At one point, an entire development team left for Nokia in a single stretch, taking a project they'd started at Motorola and continuing it for a competitor instead, a humiliating vote of no confidence from the company's own talent. Investors were furious. A company that had built the first mobile phone, that had radio equipment on the moon, was down to a humiliating slice of the global handset market, with nothing distinctive in the pipeline. Something had to change, and the pressure from the board eventually forced the mobile division's leadership to swing hard in the opposite direction. At the end of 2002, the mobile phone group got something it hadn't had in years: real freedom and real money, to build something bold. It's worth sitting on that for a second, because it's the hinge the entire rest of this story turns on. Motorola wasn't short on talent. It was never short on engineering ability. What it had been short on, for years, was permission. The designers and engineers who would go on to build the company's most famous product had reportedly been sitting inside Motorola's walls the entire time, quietly capable of something extraordinary, but boxed in by a leadership culture obsessed with uniformity and function over identity. All they needed was someone willing to say yes. What came out of that shift was the Motorola RAZR V3, and the way it came together is far stranger than most people realize. The push started with Motorola's marketing chief, Jeffrey Frost, who had come over from Nike and understood branding in a way most phone executives at the time simply didn't. He's also credited with pushing the "Hello Moto" tagline that would later become inseparable from the brand, turning a simple phrase into an actual ringtone melody millions of people would come to recognize instantly. Frost pulled together designers and engineers in Chicago in late 2002 with a simple, almost absurd challenge: build the thinnest phone anyone had ever seen. Early sketches aimed for something around 10 millimeters thick when folded, at a time when Motorola's actual production phones were considerably bulkier than that. The working project, and eventually the working name, became RAZR, built around the image of a phone as thin and sharp-edged as a blade. The team assembled to actually build the thing was small and deliberately isolated. Roughly 20 designers and engineers worked in a single dedicated space, under a level of internal secrecy Motorola hadn't applied to a consumer product before, with almost no discussion allowed outside the immediate group and strict limits on documentation or photography of the work in progress. Leadership originally wanted the finished phone ready in time to unveil it at a major awards ceremony, giving the team well under a year to take the project from sketches to a finished, manufacturable device, an extraordinarily tight runway for a phone built almost entirely from scratch. The design process itself was unusually deliberate for a company that had spent years cranking out iterative, function-first devices. The team reportedly started with pure paper sketches, no consideration yet for what components could actually fit inside, then moved to wooden mock-ups to nail down the shape and feel in the hand, then plastic prototypes, refining the form again and again before engineering even started solving how to cram real components into that shape. The engineering team, led by a veteran engineer who had previously worked on Motorola's earlier StarTAC flip phone, faced problem after problem trying to hit that thinness target. The camera modules available at the time were thicker than the entire phone was supposed to be, so the team settled for a simpler, thinner camera instead of the top spec available. Battery technology of the era couldn't be shrunk enough either, so engineers redesigned the internal layout, tucking the battery directly behind the motherboard so the components could sit flush against each other, which pushed the phone's width out slightly to make the thinness work. The antenna created its own crisis. Normally, an antenna sits near the top of the phone by the earpiece, but RAZR's metal body would have blocked or distorted a signal placed there. Switching to plastic would have killed the premium feel the whole design was built around, and putting the antenna near the bottom, close to where people typically grip a phone, raised concerns the team needed to test and solve before they could ship. Engineers were sent out with a tight deadline to find a fix, and they eventually landed on placing the antenna low, under the external speaker, behind a plastic strip they nicknamed the chin. It worked, and Motorola would reuse that same solution in phones that came after RAZR. Development kept forcing compromises. The team dropped the memory card slot, moved buttons around, and standardized on a single mini USB port that handled charging, data transfer, and headset connections all at once. A genuinely forward-looking choice most competitors hadn't adopted yet. The signature backlit metal keypad, one of the phone's most distinctive design touches, was manufactured under serious time pressure to hit the deadline, and that 10mm target the whole project was built around turned out to be physically unreachable. The final phone landed closer to 14mm, still dramatically thinner than anything else Motorola was making, but a real compromise from the original pitch. The original plan was for RAZR to be less a mass-market product and more an image piece, manufactured in limited numbers, distributed to celebrities, shown off to build buzz around the brand, then quietly discontinued after a few months. Development ran late enough that the phone missed its intended splash moment entirely, and when Motorola's own internal teams and outside focus groups finally saw it, the reaction was lukewarm at best. At a price around $500, most people involved in the process didn't expect the thing to sell. Even the name almost didn't survive to launch. Through most of development, the working name was simply the Motorola V3, with RAZR treated as an internal code name for the thin, sharp-edged design language. Somewhere in the final stretch before release, someone recognized that the code name captured the product's identity far better than another string of letters and numbers ever could, so the company dropped the working title and let the nickname become the real one, trimming a letter off along the way for symmetry. At the time, that was a genuinely unusual move. Phones were still overwhelmingly sold under alphanumeric names, strings of letters and digits that meant nothing to anyone outside the industry. Building a phone around a real, memorable word, instead of a model code, turned out to be one of the quieter, but more influential decisions in the entire project, and within a few years, nearly every major manufacturer had followed the same playbook, giving their flagship devices actual names instead of code strings. It launched in 2004, and it did not behave like a niche image product. It behaved like nothing Motorola had ever released. Demand outran supply almost immediately, and by the end of that year, the company had already moved through its entire planned production run for the year. Motorola scrambled to revise every internal forecast, slashed the price to widen the audience further, and ramped up production from an original plan of roughly 2 million units for the following year to an order closer to 20 million. The phone kept selling in huge volumes through 2005, then 2006, then remained in production all the way into 2008, an almost unheard-of lifespan for a phone in an industry where most models were replaced within a year or two. The phone stayed in production for roughly 4 years, an almost absurd lifespan in an industry that typically cycled through flagship models within 12 to 18 months. Even as the price dropped from its original $500 tag down toward the $100 range by 2007 and 2008, demand never fully dried up, and the gradual price cuts kept the decline from ever looking like a crash. Motorola even built a limited edition version housed in a metal case, echoing the original plan of handing the phone out to celebrities. and phones from the RAZR family showed up at major awards shows for years after launch, as the promotional stunt the company never got to pull off the first time around. By any normal measure, RAZR should have been the foundation for years of Motorola dominance. It had the brand recognition, the sales numbers, and a genuinely iconic design that competitors scrambled to copy. Instead, it became the thing that let the rest of the company stop trying. Here's the myth reversal at the heart of this story. RAZR didn't fail to save Motorola from the iPhone. RAZR's success is the reason Motorola had nothing ready when the iPhone actually arrived. Once RAZR started printing money, internal incentives at Motorola shifted hard toward protecting that cash flow rather than building whatever might come next. Resources that could have gone into next-generation research got redirected into feeding the RAZR machine, squeezing out variant after variant, chasing the same design language long after it had stopped being fresh. Genuinely forward-looking projects lost funding and attention because nothing could compete internally with a product that was already selling itself, and it's always easier to greenlight another version of a proven hit than to bet real money on something unproven that might not pay off for years. Executives who had been skeptical of RAZR before launch reframed themselves as the visionaries behind its success once the sales numbers came in, which made it even harder for anyone inside the company to argue that the RAZR strategy needed to change, because admitting the strategy had a shelf life meant admitting the people now taking credit for it hadn't actually planned for what came next. This is the trap success sets for companies that don't see it coming. A flop forces you to change. A hit convinces you that you don't have to. Motorola's leadership spent years treating a phone that was supposed to be a short-lived image campaign as if it were a permanent business model, and by the time the sales numbers finally started softening, the company had nothing else ready to take its place. The clearest evidence of how badly this went came from Motorola's partnership with Apple. In 2004, while RAZR was just taking off, Apple was making the most popular music players on the planet, but hadn't yet built its own phone. Steve Jobs approached Motorola about a joint device that would combine Motorola's phone hardware with Apple's iTunes software, and Motorola's leadership, eager to be associated with Apple's momentum, agreed. A carrier partner signed on to help distribute the resulting phone at a subsidized price. The result was the RAZR E1, unveiled in September 2005, and it landed about as badly as a product can land. It looked like an existing Motorola phone with a coat of white paint. It could only load music by connecting to a computer with a cable, no wireless transfer of any kind. It arbitrarily capped users at 100 songs, regardless of how much storage their memory card actually had. You couldn't even set a purchased song as your ringtone without paying extra through the carrier. Reviewers and customers tore it apart, and it went down as one of the most disappointing product launches of the decade. Motorola had fronted much of the advertising spend for a phone that actively damaged both companies' reputations. The fallout mattered more than the embarrassment alone. The RAZR failure effectively ended any deeper collaboration between the two companies, and Apple went on to build its own phone entirely in-house instead, unconstrained by a partner unwilling or unable to execute at the level Apple wanted. Motorola, meanwhile, kept leaning on RAZR variants and small iterations rather than a genuine next-generation platform, even as competitors closed in from every direction. Nokia had a run of genuinely excellent phones in the mid-2000s, releasing devices that pushed cameras, multimedia, and early smartphone features well past anything Motorola had on shelves. Sony Ericsson and LG were shipping strong, well-reviewed devices of their own. Samsung, still years away from becoming the dominant force it is today, was already aggressively iterating and absorbing design ideas from every competitor it could study, Motorola very much included. Motorola's own follow-up efforts told the whole story. Instead of a genuine next-generation platform, The years after RAZR's launch produced a string of smaller, stranger experiments, and minor variants riding the same design language. Nothing landed the way RAZR had. Nothing tried to. And then, in 2007, the actual iPhone arrived. Not as a partnership, not as an experiment, but as Apple's own fully realized vision of what a phone could be, built by a team unconstrained by the caution and internal politics that had strangled Motorola's own ambitions for years. By late 2007, Motorola's mobile division was hemorrhaging money, posting losses in the hundreds of millions of dollars for the year, and the company had already slipped from second place in global handset sales down to third, overtaken by Samsung. The RAZR well had finally run dry, and there was nothing behind it. A company that had once defined an entire generation of mobile design was now scrambling to explain to its own shareholders why it had nothing left to show them. This is where things stopped being just a story about bad product decisions and became a story about a company getting torn apart from the inside. In 2007, activist investor Carl Icahn began building a stake in Motorola. Icahn had built a fortune over decades through hostile takeovers and aggressive pressure campaigns on underperforming companies, and by the time he arrived at Motorola, he had a well-established playbook. Buy in, join the board, push hard for a breakup or sale that would return value to shareholders regardless of what it meant for the underlying business. He pushed the company's leadership into an internal power struggle that ended with CEO Ed Zander resigning by the end of that year. The numbers kept getting worse. Motorola posted a loss north of $4 billion in 2008, a scale of bleeding that made even the old Iridium disaster look modest by comparison. Icahn kept pressing for the company to be split apart, arguing that breaking Motorola into separate pieces, one built around the still-troubled phone business and one built around the far more stable communications and public safety equipment side, would unlock more value for shareholders than trying to fix the struggling handset business as a single unit. Leadership resisted the idea for a while, and, in fairness, the phone business did show some signs of life. Motorola began building Android-based smartphones as the company scrambled to catch up with the new smartphone landscape Apple and Google were rapidly defining, and a few of those early Android devices found real audiences and earned decent reviews. But a handful of respectable phones wasn't enough to undo years of drift, and the pressure from Icahn's camp never let up. In early 2011, Motorola formally split into two companies. Motorola Mobility took the phone and handset business. Motorola Solutions took the profitable communications and public safety equipment side, the part of the business that had never depended on chasing the next hit consumer phone. The split came with heavy layoffs and a chaotic reshuffling of leadership across both halves. Motorola Mobility, the phone business, the side of the company that had built the RAZR, lasted as an independent company for barely a year. In 2012, Google acquired Motorola Mobility for roughly $12.5 billion, a deal that was widely understood at the time to be much more about acquiring Motorola's enormous patent portfolio and strengthening Android's legal position against Apple and Microsoft than about actually wanting to build phones. Google held on to the business for a few years, released a couple of respectable Android phones under the Motorola name, then sold the handset operation off again in 2014 to the Chinese electronics company Lenovo, where it remains today, a brand name attached to a business with almost no direct link left to the company that built the Dynatac, carried Apollo 11's transmissions, and once controlled the majority of the world's pages. Motorola Solutions, the other half of the 2011 split, is still around and still independent, still profitable, still a real player in public safety communications, emergency services technology, and enterprise radio systems. the same category of unglamorous, mission-critical equipment the original Galvin brothers built their reputation on nearly a century earlier. It's the side of the business that never chased a single blockbuster hit and never had to survive off one either, and it's arguably the closest thing left to the disciplined, engineering-first culture that made Motorola great in the first place. Carl Icahn, for his part, walked away from the whole affair having done exactly what he does. He never claimed to be trying to save Motorola's identity or its legacy. His job was extracting value for shareholders, and by that narrow measure, the breakup and eventual sale did exactly what he'd pushed for. Whether the company he broke apart could have found its own way back to relevance with more time and a steadier hand is one of those questions nobody gets to answer for certain, because by the time he showed up, the company was already too weakened by its own decisions to put up much of a fight. So no, the iPhone didn't kill Motorola. By the time the iPhone existed, Motorola had already spent most of the 1990s bleeding money into a satellite network nobody wanted, spent the mid-2000s living off a single design that made leadership complacent, burned its best shot at a real software partnership on a phone so bad it became a punchline, and handed a corporate raider the opening he needed to break the company into pieces and sell off what was left. The RAZR wasn't the thing that could have saved Motorola if only the iPhone hadn't come along. The RAZR is the reason nobody at Motorola felt any urgency to build the next RAZR, right up until it was far too late to matter. Sometimes the biggest hit a company ever makes isn't the foundation of its future. It's the last great excuse not to build one.